The saloon doors flew open with a sound like a gunshot, slamming against the interior walls. A blast of winter, sharp and unforgiving, tore through the warm, whiskey-soaked air, carrying with it a flurry of fine white snow. Every head in the Redemption Saloon turned. The piano player's jaunty tune died on a discordant note. In the doorway stood Sheriff Clayton, his broad shoulders filling the frame, flanked by two deputies whose faces were grim and pinched by the cold. He was a man carved from the hard local timber, his presence alone enough to curdle the mood of any room he entered. His gaze, cold as the steel of his badge, swept across the patrons, cataloging each face, dismissing most. He was hunting. The low murmur of conversation evaporated, leaving only the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the whistle of the wind outside. In a dark corner, a figure sat alone, nursing a glass of amber liquid. She wore a black duster, worn but clean, and a black flat-brimmed hat pulled low, its shadow obscuring the high lines of her cheekbones. Her name was Lynn, though no one in this town knew it. She had ridden into Redemption 2 days ago, a ghost on a pale horse, seeking nothing more than a momentary refuge from the blizzard and the men who followed her. Her hand rested on her thigh, inches from the worn leather holster that held a Colt Peacemaker. She did not look up, but she felt the sheriff's eyes pass over her, hesitate, and then return. Her entire body went still, a predator sensing the trap. At the bar, Thomas Kane swirled the last of his beer in his mug, watching the scene unfold in the warped reflection of a dusty mirror. He was a rancher who preferred the company of his cattle to that of men. His visits to town were rare, driven only by the need for supplies. He had seen the woman in black when she arrived, a fleeting impression of grace and danger that had snagged his attention. He saw her now, the rigid set of her shoulders, the calculated stillness that screamed of a life lived on a knife's edge. He saw Sheriff Clayton begin to move toward her table, his deputies fanning out, their hands hovering near their own pistols. The air grew thick, heavy with impending violence. Clayton stopped a few feet from her table. "Ma'am," he began, his voice a low rumble, "I have a warrant for a fugitive. Description matches you." Lynn didn't move. She didn't speak. She let the silence stretch, a weapon in itself. Thomas saw it then, the faint tremor in the sheriff's hand, the predatory gleam in the deputy's eyes. They saw a cornered animal, an easy bounty. He saw something else. He saw a solitude that mirrored his own, twisted into a shape of desperation he could not ignore. Before he understood his own impulse, he set his mug down on the bar with a solid thud and stepped away from it. He moved with a quiet purpose, planting his feet on the floorboards between the law and the woman. He looked Sheriff Clayton in the eye, his own gaze level and calm. "There's some mistake, Sheriff," he said, his voice steady. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "This is official business, Kane. Step aside." Thomas didn't move. He gestured with his chin toward the woman in the corner. "She's my wife." The silence in the saloon deepened, becoming a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Every eye was now fixed on the quiet rancher who had just uttered a lie so bold, so utterly unexpected, it seemed to suck the very air from the room. Sheriff Clayton's face, a road map of weather-beaten skepticism, hardened. He knew Thomas Kane, knew him as a man who had worked his remote patch of land for a decade, a man who kept to himself with an almost religious devotion, a man who, as far as anyone in Redemption knew, was entirely alone. "Your wife?" Clayton repeated, the words laced with disbelief. He took a half step closer, his voice dropping. "Since when did you take a wife, Kane? And a Chinese one at that? You ain't been to town for a church service in 5 years. The deputies shifted their weight, their suspicion palpable. They smelled a lie, and in their line of work, lies were often the precursors to gunfire. Behind Thomas, Lynn remained perfectly still, a statue carved from shadow. Her mind raced, weighing the rancher's impossible gambit against the cold certainty of a rope or a bullet. This man, this stranger, had just thrown himself into the fire for her. Thomas didn't flinch under the sheriff's scrutiny. He held the man's gaze, his expression unreadable. "We married over in Silver Creek County last spring," he said, the details coming to him with a strange clarity, as if he were recalling a distant memory rather than inventing a fiction. "We prefer a quiet life, that's all." He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding Lynn's in the shadows. For the first time their gazes locked. He saw a flicker of something in her dark eyes, not fear, but a sharp, assessing intelligence. He gave a minute nod, a silent plea for her to trust this insane act. In that moment, a subtle transformation occurred. The tension in Lynn's shoulders eased. She slowly lifted her head, letting the light catch her face. She looked at Thomas, and the hard, defiant mask she wore softened into an expression of weary devotion, the look of a wife watching her husband defend their peace. It was a masterful performance, born of a lifetime of survival. She was no longer a cornered fugitive. She was a homesteader's wife, startled and offended by the intrusion. The shift was so complete, so convincing, that even one of the deputies took a hesitant step back. Clayton was momentarily thrown. The warrant in his pocket described a hardened killer, a gunslinger. This woman, looking at Kane with such quiet reliance, did not fit that picture. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man of his community. To wrongly accuse a settler's wife was a grave offense, a tear in the fragile fabric of frontier society. Still, doubt gnawed at him. "The warrant is for a woman named Lynn," he pressed, his eyes darting between them. "Wanted for robbery and murder." Thomas's voice was low but carried the weight of conviction. "Her name is Sarah Kane. You've got the wrong person." He said the name Sarah as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Clayton stared at him, then at her, searching for a crack in their story. He found none. The lie stood between them, solid as a stone wall. Finally, with a frustrated sigh, he relented. "All right, Kane," he said, his tone sharp with warning. "For now. But I'll be checking the records in Silver Creek. If I find out you're lying to me—" He left the threat hanging in the air, more potent for being unspoken. He turned on his heel. "Let's go," he barked at his deputies. The three lawmen retreated, pulling the cold back out with them as the saloon doors swung shut, leaving behind a silence thick with questions and a lie that now had to be lived. The patrons of the saloon, who had been holding their collective breath, slowly exhaled. A low buzz of whispers started to fill the room, voices thick with speculation. Eyes darted between Thomas at the center of the room and the woman still seated in the corner. The shared fiction had saved them, but it had also painted a target on their backs. Thomas felt the weight of those stares. He turned, his gaze meeting Lynn's once more. The mask of the devoted wife had vanished, replaced by a guarded, unreadable expression. The danger had passed, but a new, more complicated tension had taken its place. He walked over to her table, the floorboards creaking under his boots. He didn't sit. He simply stood there, a silent acknowledgment of the precipice they now stood upon. "We should go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She gave a single, sharp nod. Her movements were fluid as she rose from the chair, her black duster settling around her. She was taller than he had first thought, her posture straight and proud despite the circumstances. He went to the bar, dropped a few coins to cover both their drinks, and ignored the bartender's questioning look. Then he led the way to the door. As they stepped outside, the cold hit them like a physical blow. The snow was falling in thick, heavy curtains, muffling the sounds of the town and isolating them in a world of white and gray. The street was nearly empty, the storm having driven everyone indoors. They walked without speaking, the crunch of their boots in the fresh snow the only sound between them. The town of Redemption, which had felt like a temporary shelter just an hour before, now felt like a cage, its unseen eyes watching them from every frosted window. The lie had bought them time, but it had also bound them together, two strangers tethered by a shared falsehood. The walk to his ranch, a few miles outside the town limits, was a long and silent pilgrimage. Each step took them further from the prying eyes of the community and deeper into an uncertain alliance. He didn't know her name. He didn't know if the sheriff's accusations were true. He only knew that he had seen a look in her eyes he recognized, and he had acted. Now, the consequences of that act walked beside him, a silent specter in the swirling snow. They arrived at his homestead as dusk began to bleed into the white landscape. The cabin was small but solid, built by his own hands, with a curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. It was a bastion of solitude, a fortress against the world. He pushed the door open and stepped aside, allowing her to enter first, into the simple warmth of his home. The heavy wooden door closed with a definitive thud, shutting out the howling wind and the world that was hunting her. Inside, the cabin was spare but clean, warmed by a large stone hearth where embers glowed expectantly. A fire was laid, ready to be lit. The single room was filled with the scent of wood smoke, leather, and solitude. For a long moment they just stood there, the pretense that had protected them in the saloon dissolving in the sudden intimacy of the enclosed space. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own breathing. Lynn finally broke it. She pushed the hat back from her head, revealing a face of striking angles and eyes that held a deep, weary intelligence. Her voice was low, devoid of any accent he could place, smooth as polished stone. "Why?" It was the only word she spoke, but it contained a universe of questions. Why risk himself for a stranger? Why invite a potential killer into his home? Why tell a lie that could get him hanged? Thomas moved to the hearth, adding a log to the embers before striking a match. Flames licked up, casting flickering shadows across the room. He didn't look at her as he spoke. "I saw how they looked at you," he said, his voice rough. "Like you were already judged, already condemned." He paused, watching the fire catch. "I've seen that look before, on a good man who didn't deserve it." He offered no more detail, the memory a private ghost he had no intention of sharing. He was not a man given to grand gestures or eloquent speeches. His reasons were simple, rooted in a private code of ethics forged in loneliness and loss. He had acted on an instinct he didn't fully understand himself, and that was all the explanation he had. He finally turned to face her, his expression serious. "You can stay here until the storm passes and the sheriff cools off. After that, you're on your own." He was offering a sanctuary, not a permanent solution. He expected her to be guarded, to offer him nothing in return. Instead, she surprised him. She unbuckled her gun belt and laid it carefully on the small wooden table, a gesture of trust so profound it was almost shocking. "My name is Lynn," she said. The name Sarah evaporated between them, an artifact of a lie no longer needed. "The warrant, it's real, but the charges are false." She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "I am being hunted by a man named Franklin Sterling. He's a railroad baron. He had my father killed because he uncovered proof of Sterling's corruption. I have that proof. That's why he wants me dead. He used his influence to fabricate the warrant, to turn the law into his personal pack of hounds." She didn't offer him the whole story, just the essential, dangerous truth. It was a piece of herself, offered in exchange for the shield he had provided. He listened without interruption, his face giving nothing away. He had no way of knowing if she was telling the truth, but it didn't seem to matter. He had already made his choice back in the saloon. Her words simply gave it context. "Get some rest," he said, gesturing to a simple cot in the corner. "No one will bother you here tonight." He didn't ask for more of her story. He didn't ask to see her proof. He had offered her shelter, and she had offered him her name. In the vast, unforgiving wilderness, it was a fair exchange. A fragile truce was struck in the heart of the storm, a quiet agreement between two solitary souls. The blizzard raged for 3 days, cocooning the small ranch in a world of impenetrable white. The forced isolation created a strange domestic rhythm. Thomas rose before dawn each day to tend to his livestock in the barn, the wind a constant, violent roar outside. To his surprise, Lynn was always awake when he returned, a pot of coffee brewing over the fire. She moved with a quiet efficiency, never needing to be told what to do. She helped him chip ice from the water troughs, her small frame belying a surprising strength. She mended a tear in his winter coat with neat, precise stitches, her fingers deft and sure. They spoke little, but a language of shared tasks and mutual respect began to form between them. In the long, quiet evenings they would sit by the fire, the storm their only companion. He would watch her as she cleaned her pistol, her movements economical and practiced, a clear testament to a life far removed from the quiet domesticity she now inhabited. He saw the tension she carried in her shoulders, the way her eyes would constantly scan the windows, even with the snow piled high against them. She was a woman who could never truly rest. One afternoon, as the snow began to taper off, he saw her standing by the cabin's single window, staring out at the endless expanse of white. The fierce gunslinger was gone, and in her place was a woman lost in memory, her expression etched with a profound and bottomless sorrow. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of empathy for her, a desire to ease a burden he couldn't possibly understand. He walked over and stood beside her, not speaking, just sharing the view. After a long moment she spoke, her voice so soft he could barely hear it over the dying wind. "My father loved the snow," she said. "He said it made the world clean again." It was a small, personal revelation, a window into the life that had been stolen from her. He simply nodded, understanding that his silence was more comforting than any words he could offer. Their fragile peace was shattered on the 4th day. The skies had cleared, leaving the world dazzlingly bright and cold. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, slowly making his way toward the ranch. It was a neighbor, Henry Peters, a man known more for his gossiping than his ranching. He rode up to the fence, his eyes immediately darting toward the cabin, hungry for information. "Just checking on you after the storm, Kane," Peters called out, his voice a little too friendly. Thomas met him by the gate, his body language a clear barrier. But it was too late. Lynn had stepped out onto the porch to fetch a bucket of water. Peter's eyes widened, a flicker of greedy excitement in them. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his gaze lingering on her for a moment too long. He made some more small talk with Thomas, but his attention was elsewhere. When he finally rode off, Thomas knew with a cold certainty that Peters would be heading straight for town, his tongue loaded with the story of Thomas Kane's mysterious Chinese wife. The snow had stopped falling, but the real storm was just beginning. The whispers started the moment Henry Peters returned to redemption. They spread like a contagion through the general store, the blacksmith shop, and the saloon. Thomas Kane, the town recluse, had a wife, a Chinese wife, a woman who matched the description of the fugitive Sheriff Clayton had been hunting. The lie, meant to be a temporary shield, had become a town-wide spectacle. Sheriff Clayton felt the pressure mounting. Mayor Thompson, a portly man whose wealth was deeply entangled with Franklin Sterling's railroad interests, had paid him a visit. The mayor spoke of civic duty and the importance of upholding the law, but his meaning was clear. The railroad baron was displeased, and Clayton's job was to rectify the situation. The warrant was no longer a piece of paper. It was a demand from a powerful man who did not tolerate failure. The fragile sanctuary of the ranch was beginning to feel more like a prison. The peace they had found in the shared solitude of the storm was replaced by a gnawing tension. Every distant sound, every shadow that moved at the edge of the plains was a potential threat. One evening, as twilight painted the snow in shades of purple and gray, a more immediate danger made itself known. The low, hungry howls of a wolf pack echoed from the nearby hills, closer than Thomas had ever heard them. He grabbed his rifle from its rack by the door, his movements urgent. The wolves were after his livestock, their desperation driven by the hard winter. He burst out of the cabin, scanning the perimeter, trying to locate them in the failing light. He saw them then, a pair of gray phantoms moving toward the sheep pen. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, trying to draw a bead in the dimness. Before he could squeeze the trigger, a blur of motion appeared at his side. Lynn was there, her pistol already in her hand. 3 shots rang out, a deafening crack, crack, crack that split the cold air. The sound was impossibly fast, the reports overlapping one another. 2 of the wolves dropped instantly. The third, wounded, yelped and fled back into the hills, the rest of the pack scattering with it. The entire event was over in less than 5 seconds. Thomas slowly lowered his rifle, stunned into silence. He had known she was a gunslinger. The warrant had said as much. But seeing it, witnessing that lethal, instinctive grace, was another thing entirely. It was a chilling reminder of the violent world she came from, a world that was now bleeding into his own. He looked at her, standing in the snow, the smoke curling from the barrel of her Colt. Her face was calm, her hands steady. She was not just a fugitive, she was a warrior. The sight of her skill, as much as Peter's gossip, made the lie of Sarah Kane, the quiet wife, feel impossibly thin. Later that night, sitting by the fire, the silence between them was different. It wasn't comfortable anymore. It was heavy with unspoken truths. "Sterling didn't just frame me," she said suddenly, her voice low and intense. "He murdered my father. He presented it as a mining accident, paid off the local marshal. But I know the truth. My father kept meticulous records of Sterling's schemes, land grabs, fraudulent bonds, payroll skimming. He was going to expose him. That's why he was killed." She pulled a small, oilskin-wrapped packet from an inner pocket of her duster. "This is the proof. My father's ledgers. It's the only reason I'm still alive, and it's the reason Sterling will never stop hunting me." She had not only confirmed the sheriff's suspicions about her identity, but had also revealed the true, terrifying height of the stakes. This wasn't about a simple robbery. It was about a powerful man's empire, built on a foundation of corruption and murder. And they were standing right in its path. The inevitable arrived with the morning sun, glinting off the badges of 4 riders who crested the hill overlooking the ranch. Sheriff Clayton was at their head, his face set like granite. Beside him rode a man in a dark, expensive-looking city suit, his demeanor cold and imperious. The other 2 were Clayton's regular deputies. They rode with a grim purpose that spoke of more than a simple inquiry. This was not a visit. It was an invasion. Thomas saw them coming from the window. "They're here," he said, his voice flat. Lynn was already on her feet, her hand instinctively going to the gun belt she now wore at all times. "You should go out the back," he urged her. "Ride north. I'll buy you some time." She looked at him, then at the approaching riders, and shook her head. "No, I'm done running. This ends here, one way or another." Her voice was quiet, but held a core of unbending steel. Thomas looked at her, at the resolve in her eyes, and knew there was no arguing. He nodded once, a silent agreement, and went to the door. He met them on the porch, positioning himself at the top of the 3 short steps, a small but significant elevation. He did not invite them closer. "Sheriff," he said, his tone even. Clayton dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow. The man in the suit followed, his movements stiff and out of place in the rustic setting. "Kane," Clayton said, avoiding his eyes. This is Mr. Davies. He's a Pinkerton agent, hired by the railroad." Davies stepped forward, his lips curled in a slight sneer. He held up the warrant. "Thomas Kane, we have it on good authority that you are harboring a fugitive, a murderer and thief known as Lynn. Hand her over now, and Sheriff Clayton may be inclined to overlook your role in obstructing justice." The pretense was gone. The fiction of Sarah Kane was dead. Thomas felt a strange sense of relief. The lie had been a heavy burden. The truth, however dangerous, was cleaner. "I told you," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "She is my wife, and you are trespassing on my land." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply stood there, an immovable object, a line drawn in the snow. Davies scoffed. "A touching sentiment, but your little frontier romance is over. We are taking her." He motioned for the deputies to move forward. Sheriff Clayton hesitated, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He looked at Thomas, a man he had known for years as a peaceful, solitary neighbor, now standing on the brink of a violent confrontation. The air grew still, charged with the promise of bloodshed. The entire town, it seemed, was holding its breath, waiting to see if the quiet rancher would die for his lie. Just as one of the deputies put a foot on the bottom step, the cabin door opened. Lynn stepped out, moving to stand beside Thomas on the porch. She was not the frightened woman from the saloon, nor the quiet companion of the past few days. She stood tall, her black hat casting a shadow over her determined face. All the weariness was gone, replaced by a cold, focused fury. She looked past the deputies, past the sheriff, and fixed her eyes directly on the Pinkerton agent. "My name is Lynn," she said, her voice ringing out in the crisp winter air, clear and strong. The deputies froze. Clayton's hand tensed on his weapon. This was the confession they had come for. But she wasn't finished. "And you, Mr. Davies, are a liar and a dog sent to do the bidding of a murderer." Davies' face flushed with anger. "Arrest her!" he snarled at Clayton. But Lynn kept speaking, her words cutting through his command. "The man you work for, Franklin Sterling, is a thief who built his railroad on stolen land and laundered money. He murdered my father, Chin Wei, when he threatened to expose him." She turned her gaze to Sheriff Clayton, her eyes pleading not for mercy, but for justice. "The warrant in your hand was bought and paid for with Sterling's dirty money. It's as false as the man who issued it." The deputies exchanged uneasy glances. They were lawmen, but they were also local men. They knew the railroad brought money, but they had also heard the whispers of its ruthless tactics. Lynn's words, spoken with such raw conviction, resonated with their own unspoken doubts. Davies, seeing he was losing control, stepped forward menacingly. "These are the desperate lies of a cornered criminal," he shouted. "Do your duty, Sheriff." But Lynn held up the oilskin packet she had shown Thomas the night before. "This isn't a lie," she declared, her voice unwavering. "This is the truth. My father's ledgers. Detailed accounts of every crime Sterling has ever committed. Names, dates, figures. It's all in here." She took a step forward, a breathtaking gamble, and held the packet out toward Sheriff Clayton. The air was electric. She was offering up her only piece of leverage, the very thing that kept her alive. "Read it, Sheriff," she challenged him, her voice ringing with the moral authority of the wronged. "Read it, and then you can decide which law you truly serve, the law of the people of this county or the law of Franklin Sterling's bank account." Sheriff Clayton stood frozen for a long second, the packet extended toward him, a fuse waiting to be lit. The entire confrontation balanced on the knife edge of his decision. On one side was the smug, demanding face of the Pinkerton agent, representing distant money and unquestionable power. On the other was the earnest, defiant face of the accused woman, and beside her, Thomas Kane, a man of his own community who was willing to risk everything on her word. Clayton was a simple man in many ways, but he possessed a fundamental sense of fairness that had been chafed raw by the mayor's pressure and Davy's arrogance. He looked at the oilskin packet, then at Lynn's steady gaze. With a decisive movement, he stepped forward and took it from her hand. "Stand down," he ordered his deputies, his voice a low growl. Davy sputtered in protest. "Sheriff, this is outrageous. You are interfering with my investigation." Clayton shot him a look that could have frozen water. "This is my county, Mr. Davies, and this is my investigation now." He ignored the fuming agent and began to unwrap the packet right there in the cold morning air, the snow crunching under his boots. His deputies watched him, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and reluctant respect. As Clayton began to read, a profound silence fell over the small group. The only sound was the rustle of paper as he turned the pages. The ledgers were filled with a small, neat script, a meticulous record of corruption. His brow furrowed in concentration, his expression slowly shifting from skepticism to shock, and finally to a cold, hard anger. The proof was undeniable, a detailed map of Sterling's criminal empire. There were names of local officials who had taken bribes, records of land deeds forged, and payrolls padded with non-existent workers. It was a document of pure, unadulterated greed. It took him nearly 10 minutes to absorb the worst of it. When he finally looked up, his face was a mask of grim resolve. He had seen enough. He carefully folded the papers, tucked them back into the oilskin, and secured the packet inside his coat. He turned his gaze not to Lynn or Thomas, but to the Pinkerton agent. "Mr. Davies," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth, "your employer, Mr. Franklin Sterling, is now the subject of a federal investigation. This warrant," he pulled the official document from his pocket and slowly tore it in half, letting the pieces flutter to the snow, "is null and void." Davies' jaw dropped. "You can't do this," he hissed. "I represent powerful interests." Clayton took a deliberate step toward him, his hand now resting comfortably on the butt of his Colt. "And I represent the law in this county. Your business here is finished. I suggest you and your powerful interests get on your horses and ride out. Now, before I decide to arrest you for conspiracy to commit murder and obstruction of justice." The threat was delivered without heat, a simple statement of fact. Davies, seeing the absolute conviction in the sheriff's eyes and the suddenly hostile stances of the deputies, knew he was beaten. With a look of pure venom directed at Lynn and Thomas, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away without another word, a bitter and powerless retreat. The deputies, their faces a mixture of relief and awe, followed Sheriff Clayton's gaze to Lynn and Thomas. The lawman's expression had softened, the hard edge of authority replaced by something akin to respect. He looked at Lynn, no longer seeing a fugitive, but a woman who had endured an unimaginable ordeal to protect her father's honor. "Ma'am," he said, the word now carrying its proper weight, "I'll see to it these ledgers get to the U.S. Marshals in Cheyenne. Sterling's reach is long, but it's not infinite. Justice may be slow, but it's coming for him." He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to Thomas, a silent acknowledgment of the man's courage and conviction. Then he and his deputies mounted up and rode back toward town, leaving a profound quiet in their wake. The snow-covered landscape, which had felt like a battleground only moments before, now seemed peaceful, cleansed. The immediate danger had passed, vaporized in the cold light of truth. Lynn and Thomas stood together on the porch, the tension slowly draining out of them, leaving a shared exhaustion in its place. The lie that had brought them together was gone, but the bond it had forged remained, stronger and more real than the fiction it was built upon. They were no longer a rancher and a fugitive playing a part. They were two people who had stood together against a powerful evil and, against all odds, had won. The silence that followed the lawman's departure was deep and resonant. The world felt new, the air crisp and clean. All the lies and pretenses had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, unvarnished truth of their situation. They were two strangers, bound by a shared ordeal, standing on the porch of a lonely house in the middle of a vast, indifferent wilderness. The future was a blank page. Thomas turned to her, his voice quiet. "You don't have to run anymore." It was a simple statement, but it held the weight of a new world of possibilities. For the first time in years, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. She wasn't listening for the sound of hoofbeats in the night. The immense burden she had carried for so long had been lifted. She looked out at the rolling hills, blanketed in pristine snow, at the endless blue sky above. It was the same landscape she had seen for days, but now she saw it with different eyes. It was no longer a place to hide, but simply a place to be. "What will you do now?" he asked, his question gentle, not demanding. She let out a slow breath, a wisp of white in the cold air. "I don't know," she admitted, a hint of wonder in her voice. "For the first time, I don't have to know." It was a terrifying and exhilarating thought. He didn't press her for an answer she didn't have. He simply stood beside her, sharing the quiet and the uncertainty. He had risked his life for a lie told on impulse, a lie that had ended up bringing a hard and necessary truth crashing down upon his quiet world. He had expected to return to his solitude, but he found he no longer desired it. The silence of his home, once a comfort, now seemed empty without her presence. She had brought a storm with her, but she had also brought a strange and unexpected light. He had offered her a shield, and in return she had shown him a strength and courage he hadn't known existed. In the stillness of the aftermath, they both recognized that they had found something rare, something they hadn't even known they were searching for, a reason not to be alone. He slowly reached out, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. It was a hesitant, tentative gesture. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers curled slightly, a silent acceptance. In the vastness of the frontier, under the cold winter sun, it was a quiet promise, not of a future planned or a path defined, but of a new beginning, faced together.